Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf tzaditet. It's our first section of the new chapter. So we're in chapter 12. We started talking about a tvul Yomi and a mechusar kipurim, one who went to the mikveh but hasn't yet waited for the sun to set, or a mechusar kipurim, someone who hasn't yet brought their korban on day number 8 of, right, they went through a 7-day purification process. They're supposed to bring a korban on the 8th day. They haven't brought it yet. Einam cholkim. Okay, these are people who can't eat now. They could eat already by nighttime. Mechusar kipurim, there's a debate. Theoretically, once they bring their sacrifice, they should be allowed to eat. Seems like they might have to go to the mikveh also. Some people think they even have to wait till nighttime. But putting that issue aside, right now, he hasn't brought his korban, so they don't get a portion in the sacrificial meat. Even if, right, normally who gets a portion? Let's go through. There were mishmarot kehuna, they had a rotation, and if you were a kohen that week, you would get a portion of the meat. But it seems like you're not going to get it if you're a tvul yom or mechusar kipurim. So the Gemara asks Manan and Mile, where do we get this from? Amar Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish explains. Tamar Kra, the pasuk says, HaKohen amechate ota yochlena. This is chapter 6 in Vayikra, verse 19. The kohen whose mechate, the assumption is the one who, the understanding is, of mechate, the one who sprinkles the blood, will eat it. So what do you learn from this? Kohen ha-mechate ochel, she'eno mechate eno ochel. Who gets to eat it? It sounds like the kohen who sprinkles the blood, that's the kohen who eats it. So the Gemara says, uchlalahu, wait, is that a rule? That's not true. It's not only the kohen who sprinkles the blood gets to eat it, but harei mishmara kula de'im mechatim v'ochlim. The whole mishmar, as I said, gets it. The whole rotation, the people on rotation for that week, they get a portion, even though they didn't all sprinkle the blood of this sacrifice, and yet they get a portion of it. So that can't possibly be. To which they change it to, okay, it's not actually, first we're going to change the word mechate. It's not the one who actually sprinkles the blood. It's ra'oi lechitoi kamrina. It's anyone who could potentially sprinkle the blood, and that's why the tvul yom and the mechusar kipurim are excluded, because they can't do the work in the temple, because they can't sprinkle the blood, they don't get a portion. They say, wait a minute. And then if we stick with the literal, what it says so far, not that they don't get a portion, but since they can't do the avoda, they don't eat the sacrifice, because that's what it said. And right now, what we reinterpreted for that pasuk is not the simple reading as the kohen who sprinkled the blood, but the kohen who could potentially have sprinkled the blood. But that's going to be a problem, because the end of that phrase is will eat. But wait a minute. Not only people who could do the avoda get to eat, because who else gets to eat? Harei katan, a minor who's an underage kohen who's not allowed to do avoda in the temple, but he can't do that, but he can't do the sprinkling of the blood, ve'ochel, but he gets to eat. So that can't be right either. So we're gonna again reinterpret part of this pasuk. So the beginning part, HaKohen mechate ota, that we're good with. The kohen who could potentially sprinkle the blood, as opposed to who sprinkled the blood. And now, instead of mayochlena, yechalkena. What does it mean? We'll eat? Not we'll eat, but we'll get a portion. And that excludes the children. The children don't get their own portion. They just get to eat their fathers can give them to eat. So they're allowed to eat even though they can't do the avoda, but they're not allowed to get a portion. So right now we've got exactly what we were looking for, which is what the Mishna said, a tvul yom and a mechusar kipurim who can't do the avoda in the temple, can't sprinkle the blood. They do not enan cholkim b'kodashim. They don't get a portion of the kodashim, even though theoretically they could eat them that night. So that you now have in the pasuk, because HaKohen mechate ota, which is ra'oi lechate, could potentially, instead of yochlena, yechalkena. New reading of the pasuk. So again, the Gemara is going to summarize this. Ra'oi lechitoi cholek, she'eno ra'oi lechitoi eno cholek. And that resolved our problem of, right, if you potentially could do the sprinkling, you'll get a portion. If you can't, you don't. And that fits well with why does the mishmar get it? Because they potentially could have done it. Why does a katan get it even though he can't? Why doesn't a minor could eat but doesn't get a portion? That fits in well. And the tvul yom and the mechusar kipurim fit in also, because they can't work, and that's why they don't get a portion. But we have a problem. What's the problem? And we mentioned this, we read the Mishna. Harei ba'al mum. A Baal Mum can't do the avoda, and yet they also get a portion. Not only can they eat, they also get a portion. Okay? If you're a Baal Mum, you get to have a portion of the meat. Baal Mum Rachmana Rabye. Oh, that's because there's a different verse that is an inclusive pasuk, adding more people. And who are we going to add? The Baal Mum, the blemished kohen. What's the pasuk? Kol zachar b'kohanim. Okay, this is a few pasukim later in Kaf Bet. Kol zachar b'kohanim yochalota. Any male kohanim will eat it. By the way, these are the pasukim that are right in that section that's sandwiched in between these two pasukim are all the pasukim about kibus and breaking the earthenware vessels and koshering the nechoshet vessels, marika and shtifa, koshering or not koshering, however you understand it. So, and then sandwiched in there are these two pasukim, right? They surround it. So now we say, I'm connecting it to what we just recently learned. So now the Gemara says, Kol zachar b'kohanim means all male kohanim. Who must that be including? L'rabot Baal Mum, it's including the blemished kohanim. So now the Gemara says, wait a minute. Ema kol zachar l'rabot tvul yom. If it's including someone, it never says there anything about blemished kohanim, maybe it should include the tvul yom and exclude the blemished kohen. So, and in fact, mistabra Baal Mum havalei l'ribuye sheken ochel. And the Baal Mum, all the more so, I'm sorry, this is the answer, my mistake. Mistabra Baal Mum, it's more likely to say a Baal Mum would be included. Why? Sheken ochel, because the Baal Mum gets to eat. In other words, the Baal Mum right now, it's true, the Baal Mum, the blemished kohen, is blemished and can't ever do avoda. But right now, the Baal Mum, the blemished kohen, can eat. So that's why we'll give him a portion. Whereas a tvul yom can't eat, because right now they're impure, they can't touch sanctified items, so they can't eat. So that's why it makes more sense if we're going to give a portion to one of them and not to the other. We're going to exclude one from one pasuk and include one from the other pasuk. We'll include the blemished kohen. Gemara says, Adrabah, what do you mean? You could say the reverse. Tvul yom havalei l'ribuye dila or mechusar. Well, the tvul yom by nighttime will be able to eat and by tomorrow can even do avoda. It's very temporary. Whereas the blemished kohen, it's permanent blemish. They're never going to be able to do the avoda. They're not going to all of a sudden tonight be able to do, right? So be able to work. So it makes more sense actually a tvul yom. If we're going to include someone, maybe it should be the tvul yom. So they say, hashtami alo chazi. But in the end, it doesn't really matter because right now at this given moment, they're not ra'ui. Okay? And as it doesn't make any sense to include them because right now they can't eat. So if you can't eat now, why would we be giving you a portion? Okay? And that's why we're going to exclude the tvul yom, include the Baal Mum. Rav Yosef's going to give another answer as to why include the blemished kohen and not the tvul yom, the one who went to the mikveh and is waiting for sunset. Rav Yosef Amal, michti ma yochlena yichalkena, lichtav rachmana yichalkena. So now, it's actually going back. He's answering the question right now, but using something we talked about before. The pasuk says eat, right? We'll eat the kohen who does the sprinkling of the blood, which we explained, who could potentially do the sprinkling of the blood, eats it. But eats doesn't really mean eats. We explained it really means we'll get a portion. But they say, well, why, if yochlenu is yichalkena, is to divide it, or is to get a portion, lichtav rachmana yichalkena, it should have used the word that it really meant, if that's what it meant. My yochlena, so why did it use the word yochlena when it really means yichalkena? Shma mina ra'oi la'achila cholek she'eno ra'oi la'achila eno cholek. It shows that it really is dependent upon not only ra'oi la'avoda, but also ra'oi la'achila. And that's why the blemished kohen who could potentially eat is going to be included, whereas the tvul yom who can't eat right now is going to be excluded. So there's an allusion to that or a hint to that in the fact that the Torah chose the word yochlena when it really meant we'll get a portion and not we'll eat. By Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish now asks a question. We have two questions. One by Reish Lakish, one by Rav Oshaya. Similar kind of questions. Baal Mum v'hu tameh. What if you have a blemished kohen who's impure right now? Now, impure people can't eat kodashim, but a blemished kohen can't have, is problematic in general. So do we say like this? Ma'ushi chakula, maybe he'll get a portion anyway, because kevan de lo chaze v'rachmana rabye lo shna mali tameh mali Baal Mum. Since anyway, the blemished kohen really isn't worthy of being getting a portion from the simple reading of the first pasuk because they can't do the avoda, the ritual in the temple. So theoretically, you think they're out, but there's a special verse that says Kol zochar b'kohanim yochal, any male kohen, which included the blemished kohen. Once we include them from this extra pasuk, mali tamei mali ba'almum, well then the first pasuk, which kind of made it seem like if you're impure, you certainly can't get a portion, but right, the tvul yom, let's say, can't get a portion. But what's the difference? The ba'almum already has a special dispensation. Maybe that overrides anything. It doesn't matter if they're impure or not impure. If they're pure or not impure, I should say. Odilma ra'oi la'achila cholek she'eno ra'oi la'achila ino cholek. But wait, the whole point of getting a portion is to eat. Now, if you're impure, you can't eat. So you might be able to get a portion, but you can't eat. So if we're going to say the kohen is, the ba'almum is included, the blemished kohen, it's because he can eat. But right now he can't eat, so maybe we're not going to include him. So Rabba Tashma, Rabba says, let's see from here. It says in a different source, Kohen Gadol, makriv, this is a Tosefta in Zevachim, Kohen Gadol makriv onen, ve'eno ochel, ve'eno cholek le'echol ha'erev. Kohen Gadol is a unique halacha. It's opposed to our Mishna where we said if you're an onen, you can't do the sacrifices. A Kohen Gadol actually has to work in the temple. They're not allowed to leave. It says mina mikdash lo yitzeh. Can't leave the temple even if he's an onen. One of his close relatives died. But he can't eat, and he doesn't get a portion to eat even at night when his aninut is over. So Shema Mina, what do you see from here? He actually can do the avoda, and he still doesn't get a portion. Why doesn't he get a portion? Because he can't eat. So what do you see? It's all connected with can you eat or can't you eat? If this blemished kohen right now is impure and can't eat, well then he's not going to get a portion. So that answers Reish Lakish's question. Second question, by Rav Oshaya. Rav Oshaya asks, Tamei b'korbanot tzibur ma'u she'chakulo. If you remember, we have this concept of tumah hutrabet tzibur. Impurity is overridden when it comes to the majority of the community is tamei. So what if, when they do that korban, one of the kohanim that's doing the avoda is tamei, is impure also? Now, here we have a special dispensation, though, that he can do the avoda because because tumah hutrabet tzibur. Tumah is permitted for communal sacrifices. Mi amrinan. So do we say hamechate amar rachmana? It's all up to if you can do the avoda, and he could do the avoda. V'hainami mechateu, and he's working in the temple, and he's potentially can work in the temple. O dilma ra'oi la'achila cholek she'en ra'oi la'achila ino cholek. Now, even though we can do the communal korbanot, he's not allowed to eat from the meat. So maybe someone who can't eat can't get a portion, like we said before. So Ravina is going to, and this is why both these questions are here, he's going to bring an answer from the exact same source we just saw. I'm a Ravina Tashma, learn from here. Kohen Gadol makriv onen ve'no ochel ve'no cholek lechol ha'erev. What do you see here again? The Kohen Gadol works, but can't eat, and because can't eat, can't get a portion, or at least those two things seem to go together. Shema Mina, ro'ei la'achila bi'inan, Shema Mina, seems like in order to get a portion, you have to be potentially able to eat. So that ends that section. Okay, so that section was all about the tvul yom. What is the source for the tvul yom? We learned it from the kohanim mechatei otah yochlena, which we interpreted also mechatei as ra'oi lechatei, ra'oi to do the zrika. Potentially you can, not that you necessarily did. Yochlena means yechalkena, will get a portion. And then we connected the only people who can actually eat will get a portion. We had a special thing that included the ba'almum, the blemished kohen, because kol zochar b'kohanim yochal. That's why the blemished kohen, even though they can't potentially do the avoda, they still get to eat, and because they get to eat, they get a portion as well. Okay, that was all. And then we had the back and forth. What about a blemished kohen who's tamei? What about a tamei kohen who's working in the temple because of tumah hutrabet tzibur, special dispensation? In both those cases, we say they still don't get a portion, and that's all learned out from the Kohen Gadol. That was summary of section 1. Okay, well, that will do for our summary for the end of the daf for this part. Next, onen nogea ve'eno makriv. So now we go to the onen, which we already kind of were talking about the onen in this section, but now we're going to talk about the onen directly. So according to our Mishna, onen can touch the korbanot, the sacrificial meat. There's no problem, meaning that really just means the onen doesn't pass on impurity. Okay, it's not a problem. Ve'eno makriv, but can't sacrifice. So now they say, onen nogea, what do you mean? Uriminu. This is going to contradict the following source. Okay, this is a Mishna in Chagiga. Onen mechusar kipurim tzrichin tefillah lekodesh. Okay, I'm going to tell you the end of this because I don't tell you it, but it's going to come up later. But not for truma. So what does this mean? in onen and a mechusar kipurim, who's supposed to do their sacrifice that day, need tefillah for kodshim, meaning just for sacrificial items, which matches our Mishnah, because our Mishnah said mechusar kipurim, doesn't get the kodashim because they can't eat the kodashim that day. They need to go to the mikveh. Here's where we see they go to the mikveh, but not because they have to, just to enable them to eat sacrificial meat, not for truma. If they want to eat truma, they can do that without going to the mikveh, but they need to go to the mikveh, both in onin and in mechusar kipurim, for sacrificial meat. Well, the mechusar kipurim fits very well with our Mishnah, but the onin completely goes against our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says nogea, you can touch sacrificial meat, there's no problem. So Amar Rabbi Ami, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, lo kashya. Okay, the first resolution to this contradiction, Rabbi Ami says, kan b'shetaval, kan b'shalo taval. It all just depends on, did you go to the mikveh or did you not go to the mikveh? Okay, we're saying that if you went to the mikveh, then you can touch. You don't have to wait for the sun to set. If you didn't go to the mikveh, then of course you can't touch the sacrificial meat. So the Gemara says, "V'chi taval my have." Okay, so the mechusar kipurim, you could say, fine, I get it. You didn't do your korban yet. You finish your korban, you go to the mikveh, and then immediately you don't have to wait for harev shemesh. But in the onen case, it doesn't make any sense. What's an onen? It's someone who's waiting to bury their parents. It's the day of death. Haven't buried the parents yet. We're going to learn that the day of death is Torah law. You're an onen. If they don't bury the parent, let's say it's parent, spouse, whatever it might be, sibling, until the next day you're an onen also, but that's not by Torah law, it's only rabbinic law. That's just an aside point we'll get back to later. But if you go to the mikvah on the day, let's say, day number 1, you're an onen, and you go to the mikvah, what? Then you can touch kodshim? Hadra le'aninut. Your aninut comes right back to you. In other words, the tefillah doesn't prevent you from being an onen. Now, when nighttime comes, your aninut is considered done, especially if there was a burial that day. And also, like I said, aninut by Torah law is that day, not the night. So how do we know that aninut comes right back after the mikveh? Which doesn't really mean it comes back. It just means that it never really went away. The tefillah doesn't resolve all the aninut issues, which also makes sense. To Amar Rabba bar Rav Huna, because here we're going to quote someone who says it. Rabba Rav Huna says, "Onen shetaval anin yito chozeret alav." Okay, you went to the mikveh. It doesn't matter. You're still an onen, and all the laws still apply. So that didn't work. You can't say he already went to the mikveh, and that's why. So second attempt to resolve this contradiction between, again, our Mishnah says you can touch, the onen can touch the stuff, and this Mishnah in Chagiga says an onen has to go to the mikveh, presumably, otherwise they can't, right? And for kodashim, it said specifically for sacrificial items, meaning you can't touch sacrificial items. So we tried to say, went to the mikveh, didn't go to the mikveh, didn't work. So now we have a second answer. Lo kashya, hada asich date, hada lo asach date. Esech hadat means that people would walk around protecting themselves and making sure they didn't get impure. But if you had a lapse of thought and you just stopped focusing on, I better watch that I don't become impure, chances are you're going to come in contact with someone who's impure. If you're not paying attention to it and you kind of say, it's not really an issue, I'm not really worrying about it, well, then we can assume that you became impure. So if you had hesech hadat, and we assume you became impure, you can't eat sacrificial meat until you go through a purification process. We assume you must come in contact with the dead, or you went to a tent where there was a dead body, or you went in a gravesite, or whatever it might be. So, or maybe a sheretz, or some sort of impurity. So they say, here's the distinction. If you had hesech hadat and you stopped worrying about becoming impure, then you became impure. So you're an onen who stopped thinking about all these things, then you're not going to be able to touch kodshim. But but if you didn't stop worrying about tum and tara, and you had in your head all along, while you're an onen, I better make sure I don't become impure, then you can still touch sacrificial meat. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, hesech hadat, if you had hesech hadat, what's the law? We assume you became impure to a dead body. Well, then the whole thing in Chagiga, that you're tzruchim tefillah, all you need is to go to the mikveh and you're fine, the kodshim. But shlishi revi by, you need sprinkling of paraduma waters on the 3rd and the 7th day. You can't just go to the mikveh and say, I'm good now. If you became impure to the dead and were worried that maybe you did. Ta'amar Rabbi Yostai, Rabbi Matun, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, hesech hadat tzricha za'ash shlishi u'shvi'i. So Rabbi Yostai, Rabbi Natun said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that if you aren't focused on, am I becoming impure or not? Right? Am I making sure not to become impure? You have to do the sprinkling on the third day and the seventh day. So that's not going to work to say, oh yeah, you could just do tefillah. So you can't say that that was because they stopped thinking about impurity. And maybe they got impure to a dead body, because there's no way. If you had, we require much more than that. So lokash. So then we're going to modify our definition and say the following. Now, this lokash is a little tricky. Until now, the lokash was our Mishnah and the Mishnah in Chagiga. Now we're saying, no, this issue that Rabbi Yostai said is hada asik hadat mitamei. We're now going to start explaining all sorts of distinctions. You could say to yourself, listen, I'm going to be really careful that I don't get impure to a dead body. That's one thing. But I might not be careful about other impurities. So that's what we're going to say. Rabbi Yostai, you said you have to do, if you have asik hadat, you have to do 3 and 7. He was talking about when I really wasn't careful about even impurity to the dead. But the Mishnah in Chagiga, which said all you need to do is tvul, is talking about, we're still going to say that same thing. Our Mishnah was, you were very careful, and that's why you can touch kachim, because you made sure not to come in contact with anything impure. The Mishnah in Chagiga was talking about, you had in mind, you said, I'm going to make sure I don't become impure to a creepy crawler creature. That I'm checking, that I'm making sure about. But, sorry, that I'm not making sure about. In other words, I'm making sure that I'm not going to get impure to a dead body, and that's why I don't need 3 and 7. But if I didn't really pay attention, maybe I came in contact with a creepy crawler, some sort of lighter tumah, if I really didn't care about that and I kind of forgot about that and wasn't focused on it, then I'll need to do the tefillah before I eat. Okay? That's the issue. So now, before I eat sacrificial meat. So now the Gemara says, Tmei sheretz, tamei ma'al yehu, harav shemesh bai. Wait a minute. What did it say in Chagiga? All you need to do is go to the mikvah. What happened to harav shemesh? That's a regular tumah. That's not going to work. So you can't, again, it's just not going to be a good way to explain that, right? The Mishnah there. You can't say the Mishnah in Chagiga is a case where I stopped thinking about too much sheretz, even though I was very careful not to be impure to anyone who died. But that's not going to help, because what does it say in the Mishnah there? I need to go to the mikveh. That's all. Nothing more. I don't need to wait till the sun sets. And I can eat kachim already. And not only that, v'od afilu truma nami. Now, if we're worried, what did it say there? I mentioned this before, even though the Gemara hadn't said it. It says I need tefillah for kachim, but not for truma. What do you mean? If we're concerned that I became impure to a sheretz because I wasn't paying attention, I can't eat truma either. So that can't be. So Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, okay, Rabbi Yirmiyah is going to get more detail-oriented. Be'omel, it's someone who says, Nishmarti midavar ha-mitam'eni, v'lo nishmarti midavar ha-posleni. Okay. This is a very rare kind of case, but there could be a situation, okay, we're going to talk about this later, where someone eats truma. If you eat truma, that's impure. It became tameh. You become a shlishi while you're eating it. Okay, that turns you into a shlishi because I ate it. And then, if I'm a shlishi, the only thing I can make impure is kachim. This is a rabbinic type of tumah, impurity. So you could say, listen, I was very careful. I didn't come in contact with anything that's going to make me impure, like a sheretz or anything else, but anything even by rabbinic law, where the whole thing is harav shemesh is by Torah law. If I'm impure by rabbinic law, all I need to do is go to the mikvah. I don't need to wait till the sun sets. So if I say, I was very careful not even to get into any kind of impurity like that. The only thing I wasn't careful about, that's litam'eni, which means it'll make me impure in a way that I could pass on impurity to other things. But I wasn't careful midavar posleni. I wasn't careful from something that could have turned me into a shlishi, which only has ramifications for kachim. So we find some crazy, unique case where I said, I'm careful about everything else. I just wasn't careful about that. Maybe I ate truma that was impure and then I became a shlishi. That's just one example, but there's some rare cases where I could become a shlishi, where I could only pass on impurity. Truma goes only till shlishi, but kachim goes to revi. Right? Remember, Rishon, there's an Av can make someone a Rishon can make something a Sheni can make something a Shlishi can make something a Revi. Shlishi is only relevant for Truma and Kachim, and Revi is only relevant for Kachim. So we'd have to have a situation where I became impure again. It would only be on a rabbinic level, because there is no Torah level where a person becomes a Shlishi. But it would be a rabbinic case, and that would be the situation. Okay. So we figured out how we could say the difference between, again, it's a very hard ukimta, I would say, to establish the Mishnah only in that case. But the Mishnah, when it said the only needs tefillah for Kodesh, would be a case where he wasn't careful about things that maybe were going to make him disqualified. Okay, some sort of impurity. So the Gemara says, is there such a thing that things are partially, you could say, I was careful about certain levels of impurity, but not others? Is there such a thing? Yes, there is. In fact, we're going to see not with people, okay, not with tuma on a person, but tuma on objects. V'hatanya, here's a bright. Odeu hasal al rosho umagrefa betocho. Okay, we have a case where someone has a basket and there's a shovel inside. It's not exactly a shovel. There's figs inside, and the figs are sticky. They use a certain implement to get the figs to separate them from each other. Ve'amal, and the person said, Libi ala sal ve'en libi ala magrefa. So the sal is on the person's head. That's where people carry baskets then. They carry baskets on their head. And he said, listen, I'm very careful about this basket to make sure it doesn't become impure, but I really wasn't thinking about the implement inside becoming impure. So hasal tahor v'magrefa tme'ah. So we say that the sal, the basket, is pure, but the implement inside, the shovel, let's call it, is impure because I wasn't careful. So now they say, wait a minute, if the implement inside is in there and it's touching the basket, v'titame magrefa l'sal, why wouldn't we say that tool makes the basket impure? So they say, ein kli matame kli. A vessel isn't matame another vessel. Okay, there's no such thing. Vessels are matame, they pass on impurity to food and drink, not to other vessels. But then if the magrefa becomes impure, it's touching the figs. Shouldn't it make the figs impure? Why don't we say that? So Amarava, here comes what we're looking for. Because before we just had, you were protecting, you said I was careful about the basket, I wasn't careful about the implement, but that's not the same as saying I'm careful about impurity to a dead, but not a sheretz, or I'm careful about a sheretz, but not about this shlishi weird case, okay? So that's what we're looking for. So Rava says, why are we not concerned about the figs? Because it must be a case where, now, in order for the figs to become impure, you would have to say that the implement could have become impure. It could have come in contact with an avatuma, which would make it a rishon, and that would pass on impurity of sheni to the figs. Or if they were truma, right, it could pass on shlishi. It could be that it came in contact with a rishon, it became a sheni, the sheni could pass on to a shlishi. So what he says, Rabbi says, Ba'omer shmartia midavar hamitam'a v'lo shmartia midavar posla. Again, he says, I was careful not to have it come in contact with anything that could have made it impure, and then that would have passed on impurity, and that's why it's not passing on impurity of the figs, but I didn't protect it for something that could have disqualified it. In other words, then that would be the end game. That would be the final thing. It wouldn't be able to pass on impurity, meaning a lower level of tumah. That I wasn't careful about. Maybe it came in contact with a lower level tumah in a way, again, by rabbinic law, it would have made it pass on impurity to something else, right? I wasn't allowing it to become in contact with anything that was going to be able to pass on impurity to anything else. And that's why the figs are not impure. So here you have a case where there's a split in what the person thought. I was careful from this, but I wasn't careful from that. Okay. So now this thing comes before Rabbi Abba bar Mama. Now what? Okay, let's just remember. We had a contradiction between the Mishnah and the Mishnah. And we had two ways to resolve. We said maybe our Mishnah, where it says no one can touch, is because he already went to the mikveh. Versus the Mishnah in Chagiga, where he hadn't gone to the mikveh. We rejected that because what Rabbi Rafuna said, can't be, because you're still forbidden, even if you didn't go even if you went to the mikveh, the aninu comes right back. So it must be you were careful about impurity, the onin, and he didn't let his mind go off of being protected from impurity, versus the Mishnah in Chagiga, where he wasn't, but again, it was only for kachim, because that's, you have to explain the Mishnah there, why it said only for kachim, not for truma. It would have to be you weren't careful about certain particular type of impurity. Now, when the sugya comes before Rabbi Abba bar Mama Lamar Lahu, he said to them, Lo shmi'alei hada amar Rabbi Yochanan amar Rebbe, did you not hear what Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rebbe? Ha'ochel shlishi shel truma, this is why I told you we were going to get to this. If you eat a shlishi of truma, asur le'echol, okay, if you eat a shlishi of truma, you can't eat, you can't eat anymore, you're becoming pure, but mutar liga, you can touch things, okay, you're allowed to touch. If you ate a shlishi of truma, you're allowed to touch. And then he says, right? Now, what can you touch? So Rashi tells us, just so you don't get confused, mutar liga b'truma. Why are you allowed to touch truma? Because if you eat a shlishi of truma, you become a shlishi. A shlishi can touch truma. Okay, so alma ba'achila avi rabbana mala b'negia lo avi rabbana mala. Now, what do we see here? I ate a shlishi of truma. So now, right, something that was impure of truma. I can't eat truma, but I can touch truma. So what do you see here? There's a distinction between what I can't eat and what I can touch. So now we're going to say the following. Alma ba'achila avi rabbana mala. So when it says you need tefillah for kodesh in chagiga, it wasn't talking about touching it. Touching it is not a problem. That's what our Mishna says. Just like there, touching is not a problem. Also here, an onen can touch, but it doesn't mean the onen can eat. Sometimes we're more strict about eating than we are about touching, and that's what we learned from that shlishi of truma case. And we're going to say the same thing is true by us. The onen can't eat kachim, but he can touch kachim, and that resolves the conflict in the most simplest way possible. Okay, moving on. Eino cholek lechol. Now we're up to the onen, doesn't get a portion. Miflag hu delo palig. Miflag hu delo palig. He doesn't get a portion, but what? V'chimazam nule achil. Sounds like doesn't get a portion. It doesn't say he can't eat. So it sounds like if someone invites him to eat, the onen can eat with them. Sacrificial meat. But wait, urimini says in a different source. Okay, this comes up in Pesachim. Onen, okay, whether they take out the words here, mechusar kipurim, but in onen, tovel ve'ochel epischol erev, aval lo b'kodeshim. It says the onen is allowed, there's a special dispensation, he can eat the korban pesach, but he can't eat kachim in general. So now, how can the onen eat kachim in our Mishnah? But here, in this source, it says he can't eat kachim. So Amarav, again, we seem to have a lot of contradictions today between different Tanaitic sources. Amarav Yomi difti lo kasha. Kam b'Pesach, kam b'Shar Yemot HaShana. So now we're going to have an interesting resolution. It's going to be hard to understand for 1 minute. When it says he doesn't get a portion, but it sounds like he can eat, that's our Mishnah. That's talking about on Pesach night. And then he can eat kachim. But b'Shar Yemot HaShana, in Pesachim, what did they say? Now you have to be careful and listen to what it said there. In onen tovel ve'ochel pischol erev, he could eat his korban pesach, but not kachim. What does this mean? Kam b'Shar Yemot HaShana, he can't eat kachim any other night of the year. And our Mishnah is saying, dafka on leil pesach, though, when you're allowed to eat the korban pesach, which is a special dispensation, we're going to allow the onen to eat the korban pesach, you can also eat other kodeshim that night, right? People ate other sacrifices they brought that night, and you can eat that. So our Mishnah is saying the onen, when he can eat, it's only Pesach night he can eat. He can eat any kodeshim he wants. In the Tanaitic source in Pesachim, it was saying an onen can eat the korban pesach, but he can't eat other kodeshim on other nights of the year. Only korban pesach is allowed, nothing else on other nights. Okay, so Pesach, I did acha Pesach, achanami kodshim. But b'Shar Yemot HaShana, de lo chaze, lo chaze. And that just explains what I said, which is once you can eat on Pesach, we allow you to eat other things. But other nights of the year, you have no special dispensation for the korban Pesach, so we're not going to let you eat any other kodashim. That's the first resolution to this contradiction, Rabbi Yomi difti. And then my avaloba kodashim, how do you explain that? Avaloba kodashim shel kol hashana. When it says, but not kodashim, it didn't mean that night. It says, on Pesach, you can eat the korban Pesach. And then add in parentheses, and all other kodashim. And when it says, but not kodashim, it meant, but you can't eat other sacrifices any other night of the year. Okay, and that's a way to resolve the contradiction. A little bit complicated, because also particularly our Mishnah, when it says an onen can eat kodashim, it's now only on Pesach night, which is weird to say that. Right? Again, we do kimtas all the time, but you'd rather not if you can avoid it. Rav Asi gives a different interpretation. Lo kasha, kansha mate lo mate ba'arba asal, ukvaro ba'arba asal. Now here we get to the aninut by Torah law. If you buried the dead on the 14th, and your relative died on the 14th of Nisan, Erev Pesach, and you buried on the 14th of Nisan, so your aninut was over, then if you did that, then you can't eat kodshim, because that day you were in onen by Torah law. And you can't eat kodshim, okay? You can eat the Pesach, we allow you that, but we don't allow you to eat the kodshim on Pesach night. Our Mishnah is talking about kan shemet lo meit b'shlosha asal Ukvaro ba'arba'asar. Mishna is also talking about kodshim on Pesach night, but it's telling you the following. If your relative died on the 13th, and on the 14th, which is Erev Pesach, you were only an oning by rabbinic law, then we're going to allow you to eat the kodshim that night as well. Yom Kfura lo tafis leilo midrabbanan. Because the day of Kfura doesn't affect the night after it unless it's the day of the death. Okay, but if it's just the day of the burial and the death was the previous day, then it doesn't go into the night. So they're talking about, basically, if you say it in simpler terms, onen by Torah law and onen by rabbinic law. Onen by Torah law can't eat any kodshim even that night, but onen by rabbinic law can eat kodshim already that next night. Okay, that the night of Pesach night. What comes out of what we just learned is that we have two types of aninut. There's aninut the day of the death, that's Torah law. There's aninut the next day, which is if you haven't buried, that's by rabbinic law. But in addition, what they're saying is the fact that the aninut goes into the night, it in and of itself is rabbinic. Okay, that's also came out of the previous section. So now they're going to say, Man Tana, who's the Tana who says that aninut laila midrabanan, that the aninut of the nighttime is only rabbinic, and that's why we'll be lenient here. Right? We'll be more lenient by aninut at night. So that's Rabbi Shimon. Tanya aninut laila midivrei Torah. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says if it's the day of the burial, the aninut continues through the night, and that aninut is by Torah law. Rabbi Shimon Omer, ein oneh midivrei Torah, ela midivrei sofrim. He says onen at night is only rabbinic. So right now we're just saying very simply, Rabbi Shimon holds aninut at night is rabbinic. He's the one who says that. Teda, and he's going to prove it. Sharei amru, from our topic, onen tovel v'ochel pischo la'erev, aval lo b'kodeshim. So now we're going to say, how do we know? And this is where we saw before that it's only rabbinic at night, because we're going to allow, okay, let's just talk about this. If aninut by Torah law was, if aninut, we didn't really talk about this, so I want to now tackle it head on. We really were discussing whether you can also eat kodshim that night when you have the special dispensation for Pesach. But it's all based on, why do you have a special dispensation if you're an onen that day, right? If they died on the 14th and it's still the 14th, you're allowed to eat the kodshim that night for the Pesach. Why? It's Korban Pesach, right? It's very important. But if you're onen by Torah law, that's not going to override your giving of the Korban Pesach. You're going to do a Pesach Sheni like anyone else who has an issue. So the fact that we're going to allow you to eat at Pesach night is basically saying that aninut is rabbinic. And that's what Rabbi Shimon's saying here. He says, that's my proof. If they say the onen can be tovel and eat his Pesach that evening, but not kodashim, again, however you understand this, but not kodashim, right? It must be the fact that you can eat the Pesach is because it's rabbinic. So now that makes a lot of sense. But now the Gemara says, wait a minute. We have another contradiction. If we didn't have enough contradictions today, Savar Rabbi Shimon aninut laila midrabanan. Wait a minute. V'hatanya, it says in a Braita, Rabbi Shimon Omer, onen eno meshalech korbonotav. In onen, can't have other people bring their sacrifices for them. Now, if we have this whole thing about meshalech korbonotav, if you remember a while back, and you can have someone bring your korbanot for you. Because why? This let's say you're tameh that day, like a tameh sheretz. You can have someone bring your korbanot for you because you'll be able to eat at night. So they take care of it during the day. You can't be involved because you're impure, but you can eat it that night. But Rabbi Shimon says an onen can't do that. They can't have someone do their korbanot for them. Why not? If they can, right? My love. Now it sounds like my love afilu b'Pesach. It sounds like even korban Pesach. And then you'd have a problem because according to him, if aninut is only rabbinic at night, and then you can eat it at night, then he should be allowed to have someone do the Korban Pesach for him on Erev Pesach, and he'll just eat at Pesach night when he's allowed to. Sounds like he thinks aninut is by Torah law, and that's why you can't eat the Korban Pesach. So that seems to contradict what he said before. The Gemara says that's not a contradiction. Lo levar mi Pesach. It's excluding Pesach. You can't have other people do your other sacrifices, but Dafka Pesach will make a special dispensation because aninut is your Rabbanit, will override the aninut to allow you to do your mitzvah of Korban Pesach. But any other Korban, we're not going to allow you to eat. There's no motivation to permit that. But question, difficulty, V'atanya, it says, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Shlamim kashu shalem mevi, ve'enu mevi kashu oneh. What does it say? Here's a drasha. Here we're going to learn Korban Shlamim. Okay, this is all a drasha on the words, Im Zevach Shlamim. Okay, and soon you're going to see the difficulty. If you bring a Zevach Shlamim, And they darshan here, shlamim keshuhu shalem, when you're complete. Now in onen, we're going to call this someone who's not complete, because shalem is someone who's also at peace. And you're not at peace if you're in onen. You're very sad. You just lost a very close relative. So you can't bring a korban shlamim, okay, so far that doesn't do anything. What we're going to want to prove here is, we're going to see that you can't bring a korban pesach. So how are you going to say that you can bring the korban pesach? What we just said. So, and this is Rabbi Shimon. That's going to be the problem. Minayin l'rabot, we're now going to include all sorts of other things you can't do when you're an onen. How do you know? A toda. Rabbanit toda shkenechel b'simcha k'shlamim. Okay, a toda is like a shlamim. First of all, it's a type of shlamim, but even so, it's like a shlamim because you bring it for happy reasons, right? You want to give thanks. Minayin l'rabot ta'olah. How do you know burnt offerings also? Again, this means you can't bring them when you're an onen. It's similar to shlamim because you can bring it voluntarily, just like a shlamim. Oh, here's the problem. How do you know that also they can't be brought when you're an onen, which Rabbi Shimon says, which goes against what Rabbi Shimon said before? Because they don't come for a sin, just like the peace offering doesn't come for a sin. Minayin l'rabo chatav asham. Talmud lomar zevach. Zevach is a general word in zevach shlamim. So zevach is a general word. Minayin l'rabot ha'ufot v'amenachot v'hayayin v'yitzim v'alavona. Okay, birds, meal offerings, wine, wood, frankincense that you brought as offerings. Talmud lomar shlamim korbano. Kol korbanot shu mevi kashu shalem mevi ve'enu mevi kashu onen. Any sort of korban, because it says im zevach shlamim korbano. Your korban, anything you bring toward the altar, it doesn't matter what it is. If you bring it, you have to bring it when you're shalem, when you're happy, in a peaceful state, and not when you're in a problematic state. Okay? So we learn from there too, all the korbanot, basically. Anyway, the main point being, katani mi'a pesach. Pesach is in that list. So Amar Rav Chisda, pesach kedei nasbeh. Okay, interesting answer. He said Pesach got there kind of by accident. Okay, why? It actually makes sense, because if you remember, these are a threesome. Bechor, Maaser, and Pesach. So it could be they just added Pesach by accident, but Rabbi Shimon didn't really mean that. Okay? And maybe he didn't really say it, and they just misquoted him. Rav Sheshet Amar, a different answer. My Pesach, Shalomei Pesach. He means shlamim, the people bring on Pesach, but not the actual Pesach offering. The shlamim you can't eat. But if it's the regular Pesach, the one you bring for Leila Seder, for Seder night, that one, yes. Ihachi hanu shlamim, but Shalomei Pesach is just shlamim. So you don't need a special drasha for that. It's already in the main pasuk is all about shlamim. No, because tana shlamim ha'be'im machmat pesach u'tana shlamim ha'be'im machmat atzman. Right? No, they needed to tell you a drasha on that one because they needed to say not only regular shlamim, also ones that come with the korban pesach, because people would bring korbanot with the korban pesach to have more meat at the meal. Di'ilo tana shlamim ha'be'im machmat pesach salkadat hachamina hu'ilo machmat pesach atu kigu ate. Sorry. You might have thought because it comes on account of the Pesachim, because you're bringing the Pesach, you're bringing other offerings, you might have thought it goes with it. No, you need the drasha to say, no, this can't be brought, but the Pesach could be brought. So we resolved the difficulty against Rabbi Shimon, right? The whole last part of our daf is to Rabbi Shimon really hold on Ninut at night is really rabbinic, and we can allow the korban Pesach to be brought by an onen, for an onen, and the onen can eat it at night. And it seem like he doesn't say that from all sorts of other sources, but every time we brought a source, we figured out, no, he doesn't really mean Pesach here, and we resolved. Okay, so, the main source of that, he doesn't bring his korban, right? You can't have him send his korban. We said that's not really talking about Pesach, and with that, we resolved. And then even though this other source seemed to say Pesach, it didn't really mean Pesach. Okay, so let's go back. The beginning kind of summarized already about the kohen mechate and how we darshan that about the tvul yom and why the tvul yom is out and the bo'al mum is in. Gets a portion. We had these two questions of Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yoshaya that we already reviewed. Then we got to the onen, and we said an onen can touch. We had the first contradiction between the onen in our source and the onen and mechusar kipurim that need tefillah for kodesh but not for truma, that Mishna and chagiga. We had a bunch of different ways of how to resolve it, right? In the end, we had 3 different ways of resolving it. The end was a very easy one. The hesed chadat got us off on a long tangent about, can you really have hesed chadat for something and not for other things? And we said, in fact, you could. And then we ended up saying, oh, no, it's the difference between touching and eating. And that was the easiest one, right? It was the first one. He didn't even go to the mikveh. That we rejected completely because, or if we went to the mikveh, right, that wouldn't help you. Okay, that was a very quick review. I hope that was helpful. Then we got to with the onen gets to get a portion. Sorry, an onen doesn't get a portion, but he can't eat if someone invites him. And then we said that contradicts another source, and then we distinguished between Pesach and other nights of the year. And then we got into Rabbi Shimon, who that's based on the fact that we allow it for Pesach, must be Rabbi Shimon, who says Aninu at night is permitted, is only rabbinic, and that's why we can override it for Pesach. And we said, but that seems to not match what Rabbi Shimon says elsewhere, but we resolved that as well. With that, wishing everyone a good day and a last day of Hanukkah Sameach to everybody. And tomorrow we start back on Zoom. I'll be back and we will go back to our regular Zoom. Wishing everyone a good day.